Hi, Everlyn. This is Dr. Dean Blevins, and I am recording this presentation to send to you first, mainly because I don't think we have engaged with each other, except perhaps when you first came into the program, and I know you invited me to be a second reader for your dissertation. And I'm deeply aware that when I send comments back in a document, particularly when they're in red font, I could put it in a different color font, but red does stand out. So that's why I use that. I definitely wanted you to hear tone underneath. And I wanted you to have an opportunity to hear the gist of what I'm going to write before I actually send you the document itself. And there's not a ton of comments all through the document, but there's a big piece at the front end, and then there are just different elements as we move through. I have read the document. Actually, I read it first. I am printing it out, and that's always probably better because it keeps me from writing a lot of things at first, but it's not as helpful to you. And I wanted to start by sharing, since I've got your abstract up, just with a couple things I think that are kind of intriguing. And then I'm going to probably sound pretty critical for a little bit. I want you to hear this mainly as coaching, but also as just an open invitation. I know you asked me to be your reader, but as I read through the document, I'm wondering, based on the way I tend to understand DMin dissertations, whether I'm the best fit for you. So let me just say it this way. Usually as a second reader, if I'm not evaluating an artifact, I tend to kind of pick up about midway through the dissertation, paying close attention. And I see myself mainly perhaps as a specialist. And I think that's probably why you brought me on board, just asking questions around how you were using the digital engagement as well as the epic sort of constructive piece at the back end. But I had a ton of trouble as I worked through your initial draft, so much so that I'm not sure I could endorse this project unless I make some strong recommendations that you might feel go too far as a second reader, and you want to talk to Dr. Settles about that. So I've got your kind of your abstract up, which is just basically starts with this idea of moving into a digital space, church community and cyberspace, and then calling upon basically a renewed sort of endeavor around corporate prayer, and that into cyberspace and how that sort of plays itself out in cyberspace. Now, you actually have one really good sentence in here where you basically say that digital corporate prayer is one of the ways the online church community can connect to God and each other using contextualized traditional church practice. It's probably the clearest statement you made. What really makes it problematic is this through qualitative ethnographic research and in-depth interviews, and I'll come back to that. So let me start out by just saying that through the abstract, I was at least intrigued. And this last one, the study explores the possibilities that implementing principles of corporate prayer in an online platform can pave the way for the same connection to God and to each other. I get that, but then the way the dissertation is argued, I lost you pretty quickly. Now, to explain why, I'm going to show you a formatting strategy right up front that I'm going to come back to at the very end of what we discuss. But if you take your dissertation and you go up to and you'll see me move the cursor, go up to view, where you can see different, and a whole new ribbon appears at that point at the top. Normally we use it for zooming or maybe to show one or two pages. But over here on the far left, as you look at it, as you're watching the document, I hope it's on the left. Maybe my left, your right, who knows? You'll see a little box that says outline. And when you click on that, you see the entire dissertation in an outline view. and I'm going to scroll down to chapter 1. And as you can tell, it's really tightly done. That's probably the one limitation of this kind of an approach. Uh, but one of the things I'm going to show is what you're looking at the very top. You can always say, what am I looking at? Well, that's the level, the body text. Then you're going to show, well, show me the levels. And so I'm going to start with all levels. Boom. And that gives you can see these little dots, which allows you to move things around if you want to. That's one reason why I like this function. And it jumped way down. Let me move back to the top of this document. Now, one of the things I will go ahead and point out is the way this is done in your table of contents. If I ask for the first level only, well, you actually apparently set up your chapter headings using the first level, except for chapter 5. You missed that one. If that happens, something you go back and fix. But we're going to also point out that everything else after that is just shown as body text. And so you have to go back to all levels since everything else is body. And that's, if you look at this, that's not any of the other levels. That creates a problem. So we'll fix that, and I'll show you some strategies later. But for now, let me just point out something that I think is really important. So again, I think your abstract's fairly intriguing, but when you get into, and this covers a lot of, as you can tell, it covers a lot of text in a hurry, getting to the general outline of chapter 1, you give me a general statement, and then you give me statement of problem, textual framework of the study, research questions, procedures, definition of terms, the limitations of the study, purpose of the study, and that's it. And in a way, it feels almost as if what you give me in chapter 1 is maybe what you turned in one of your research classes and what you intended to cover and study as a part of the program and your dissertation process. But a dissertation actually should reflect the conclusions of that work much more clearly than that. Now, there are some social science models and empirical models where you might utilize these categories early in a paper. Definitely, rarely. I don't think they're always used that much in extended writings like dissertations or theses, as they would be called in certain places. But you might use them in a paper as you were setting up some kind of a social science research project or a lab experiment, and that becomes sort of how that material gets used. But what I normally look for right from the very beginning in a regular dissertation, once you've completed that work, is that the introduction includes, well, what was the contextual problem that you were facing that motivated you to do this? What is the answer that you think you've already discovered? I mean, in some ways, you're trying to tell me up front what's important that we need to pay attention to, and then give me an outline in the introduction of how you're going to prove the case that this is important for me to follow as I read this material. And I have to admit that the way you have sort of designed this first draft of the dissertation, I don't get really even some of the answers you're suggesting in the abstract. I'm not getting a very clear introduction to the argument until around page 70 to 72. I have to get that far in to have what I would call a detailed sort of rationale for why we should pay attention to corporate online prayer practices and their application within an online environment. And it may be that is part of the problem I wrestle with each chapter, that most of the time the way you would sort of start the chapter is almost like, well, this is the next layer of the experiment. This is the next piece of the study, not telling me a story of how this how this research comes together to argue for me really reading it all the way to the end and agreeing with what you think is important. You delay any sort of insights, and you don't necessarily build an argument along the way. Instead, I just feel like I'm getting exposure. Well, the next thing I studied is, and the next thing I studied is, and that's not very compelling for a doctoral level dissertation. So I'll just name that up front. Now, I think as you get into the next couple of chapters, again, you keep going back to the frameworks, theoretical frameworks, or later. There are moments you give me good material, like the history of the online church. That was helpful. Then you move into theology of church connection, theology of the online church, and legitimacy of the online church. And I probably did struggle a little bit whether church connection, that language, should actually put that segment after the theology of the online church, because it's the church in connection, and then the legitimacy of that connection, what you're really trying to get at. Those are quibbles in organizing different patterns, because you finally get into online community connections, and again, starting up here with connection and then coming back to it later just linearly doesn't seem to flow that well. But you're doing okay, except that when we get to the next chapter, or when we get to actually chapter 3, the examining of the corporate prayer practice, I wondered how that was such a radically different chapter than from chapter 2. It's a quibble, but those might be put together, since I was really hoping that the more constructive work is when you take portions of this chapter, not all of it, but portions of this chapter, and combine it with, particularly combine it with the next, and you see how long this chapter is. Combine that with the next chapter, which is the digital corporate prayer component. Now, I'm going to stop for a second and let me say that the flow it just felt like each chapter was sort of independent to each other. There were moments where you were showing connectors, either from the last of the previous chapter to the first of the next. That actually probably happened better between 2 and 3 than anywhere else. But outside of that, I really did just sort of struggle with the overall tenor of how each of these chapters felt like independent projects rather than a sustained argument over time. Now, I think you do have a sustained argument over time. I'm actually, one way to just give you what I finally determined as the gist of the argument, and you're going to see this paragraph when I send you the material. What I thought you said was basically that the online church, which is a necessity since COVID, struggles with assuring a common identity and common bonds of community via connection, either to each other or to God. However, previous research on online church fails to take into account the role of corporate prayer practices, and its application in a digital environment. A more deliberative attention to corporate prayer practices expressed in digital prayer movements, particularly in global settings, provides a stronger approach to understanding the benefits of online church. This information, particularly when coupled with intentional use of epic prayer practices, provides a clearer vision of online church that connects both identity and community, to each other and to God. So that part, I'm like, okay, I could, if you could make that clear, almost take that set of statements and just sort of build your chapters around that. I get it. It's also that in the introduction, you need to let me know that's where you're going to go. Now, so one of the things I struggled to get to adjudicating whether you had really delivered or not was just in the writing style and the way in which the introductory chapter really doesn't help me understand that, not that well. You can still keep things like terms or framework, but I really don't think you have really made your argument clear as you work your way across each of the chapters and get into the synthetic and constructive pieces around epic at the end. And that's going to be a major piece of the rewriting. There is one other thing that I think that is methodologically problematic, and I'm just going to name it. Going back of all things, and let me just close the outline view for a second and go all the way back up to the very top for just a minute. And in your abstract, you appeal to an qualitative ethnographic research and in-depth interviews. And what I'm about to say may be very painful, but you're going to see it in the writing. I don't think you've delivered on that. So I just have to be honest with you. When it comes to qualitative research, and particularly a very deliberative approach to using ethnographic method in the interview process, you don't make that clear enough for me. It would be normally that chapter 4, if there's one place where you would want to talk very deliberatively about methodology, it would be in what justifies your conclusions coming out of what I would call good, well-documented ethnographic research. And that would include things like, well, protocols. And in some ways, what were the questions and how did you set those up? What was the process and how is it that you basically followed appropriate interview protocols and guidelines when it comes to use of human subjects? And how did you then basically critically analyze that data by not merely just reporting on each of the interviews, as you call them. I might even call them conversations, since there's not I didn't see say an appendix with a clear interview protocol and set of interview questions that correlated to, say, your research around the corporate practices, so that you had a very deliberative way, even if you were trying to do something phenomenological, at least how there was an interview protocol for each of the interviews so that they were each done consistently. They were recorded time, date, location. And then there was, say, for instance, the use of a transcribing of that material in such a way that you could then look for key threads, concepts, and ideas through SPS or some other kind of social science ethnographic strips of analysis. So I didn't get any of that kind of really careful delineation of how those interviews / conversations really were true ethnography in the way in which that's understood and done in any kind of qualitative studies guides. And I did have doctoral work that included how do you do good ethnographic research and the kind of guidelines that goes with participant observation or goes with case study method. And I didn't see you set that up and didn't see that them backed up in an appendices. And as a journalist, the other thing I didn't see you do is basically compare, contrast the different reports and even correlate sometimes what the subjects said with secondary literature that actually confirms some of their own observations and statements. None of that's there, and the DMin's not really designed for you to be able to do that. I think you can salvage that material, but I really want you to hear that if you're making the claim that this DMin is based on quality ethnographic research, that's your response to the failed literature that's already there. You just didn't close that loop for me. And I would be the first one to say, no, as a doctoral dissertation, albeit DMin, it's just not there. Now, there's something you can do, and I'm going to stop the share screen for a minute so you can just see my face. And I really want you to hear That's a really if your research classes were designed to prepare you to do ethnographic research, and those classes said you have actually done that work, then again, maybe it's best for me to step off this committee. But if you brought in an ethnographic methodology and did not take the time in the writing of the dissertation to really do the crucial front end work, even if it's called an ethnographic case study, just to assure that you were getting asking common questions and getting at least affording each of the people that you talked with or conversed with online the same opportunities to respond equally to the same types of questions. That you were mindful, albeit they're adults, they're not children, but you were mindful of the use of that information, and that they had, they basically had signed off, they given permissions, and they knew exactly how it was going to be used. All the kinds of things that we always have to do in any kind of traditionally IRB backed use of human subjects. Um, I I think there's better not to try to utilize this dissertation in that way. Now, what can you do? So let me just go ahead and say, the good news is you can still preserve even some of your reporting out of those conversations. I'd even drop the language of interview, and I would just get rid of qualitative ethnographic research and just talk about contextual analysis. I mean, that's a fair use of what you do in DMin, and you did do contextual analysis. You did review these websites and these kind of corporate initiative, these global initiatives, and you could probably just cite the websites in several places and still use that constructively later in your dissertation. But I would take those three conversations and move them all the way to the introduction. And when you're talking about the online church struggling through the Barna research, where it does seem not to have any kind of a positive appreciation, at least in the people who participate within it. That was the George Barna critique. You could then say, but here's some interviews that seem to gesture toward an alternative articulation. So why is this particular interpretation the one we tend to look at, Barna, the negative one, when we have these kind of positive reports or conversations? Then using that at the end of the introduction, that sets up, well, maybe we haven't looked at the literature and asked the right questions, and maybe we can ask more substantive questions around what is corporate prayer. And I would kind of put those two together in the next chapter. And then and then as you move into your synthesis out of your review of literature, you could take then the best of what you're seeing from just what we've learned about corporate prayer, and the best of what it seems to be happening globally through these digital platforms. But we can call them case studies. It's just contextual analysis. We can find some principles that show that online corporate prayer does provide the kind of connectivity that we would hope to see happen in any kind of community, both in common identity and common relationship. It's probably the language I would use, but that connectivity does happen. And then your constructive piece is the same, but that doesn't just happen unless we actually really pay attention to these principles and actually, you would suggest, and amplify them through a particular approach known as EPIC. Now, I'm not sure where EPIC came from. That's one place I haven't read carefully, but I know EPIC as a term has been bandied around in 3 or 4 different frameworks, including an approach to worship, actually an approach to children's ministry at one point, an approach to other forms of innovation in youth ministry at one place. So this term EPIC has been around a while, and you might need to at least gesture that this is not new, and find a way to triangulate that with some of these other movements that have been around over the last 10 years. There was a kind of a joke at one point when I was still making the rounds in age level ministry that everything was epic or nothing was. And so that's why we want to caution you to kind of go, I think you're fine in your dissertation to use it, but at least acknowledge that that terminology has a history and a source. And if you did, make it more clear. I mean, that you started that section through the subheading recommendations. And I'm like, wait, this is the most constructive piece. It's not just a recommendation. This ought to be almost the beginning of a final chapter, or maybe part of your really most important piece of your synthesis, and how you're doing that. So rather than resting upon the claim to an ethnographic research methodology, which if you do, at least I would have to get off the ship, because I just can't, I just really can't see how you have documented. You may have it, but you really haven't documented how you've done that well and how you followed guidelines. And I'm not even sure our DMins are designed for you to do that kind of work. But unless you can radically rewrite the methodology, say in chapter 4, right at the front, that'd be the one place, instead of in the introduction, that you would really have to say, here is exactly all my protocols and methods. Here is everything I did to make sure that it meets the standards that would almost clear an IRB, an internal review board, as a qualitative methodology. And I have a whole set of appendices that show, here are my questions I used in every one of the interviews. Here is the kind of guided analysis that I did. Here's my use of transcriptions of those conversations in the way in which it lifted up key concepts and ideas. And so early when you say, well, the limits of this is that I'm biased in how I might have picked up on certain points, I didn't get it. Even naming it that way puts you in trouble. So I'm going to switch back to sharing screen for a minute, but let me say positively, I think my gist is like, hey, we have a real problem. And I would say in your introduction, you really need to name why it was a problem for you. I mean, you kind of start with this kind of generic thing, but what motivated you to do this? The DMin normally is designed to address a very specific context and a very specific problem. So was it your congregational context that in light of COVID? Was it a set of shared struggles with churches in and around you? What motivated you to do this work? And then what did you discover? Hey, folks, one thing we can do is, if we actually pay attention to corporate prayer, and particularly the way in which some global initiatives have actually gotten tied together through corporate prayer practices in digital environments, it can make all the difference in the world. And we haven't really explored that as well. And by the way, if we amplify it through an epic approach, this can make a real difference in the way we approach online church in the future. If you can reorganize some of your material so that you can stay focused on that and write toward that from the very beginning of the next draft of the dissertation to the end, I think then this dissertation has wheels. But the way it's written this time around, and sort of the kind of language that makes it feel more like an attempt at a pure experiential research process, really mitigates against the really more intellectual or literature-based approach of really claiming that you found something that's really different and new. That may mean some heavy rewriting if you want me to stay on board, but it would end up being a dissertation that would probably get people's attention. And it would bracket those interviews more in a way that treats them more authentically as just conversations that you had that really were inspiring and helpful, but they are used early merely to point toward an argument from a distillation of the best of the corporate prayer study and a review of these global website initiatives or virtual church initiatives, to bring those together, define principles, and then suggest how Epic merely heightens them moving forward. And I think you would be in better shape. Now, what I'm really arguing for is also thinking about how you organize each chapter so that you build an argument to the very end and you carry me from the beginning to the end. And so I'm going to go back for a share for just a minute and see if I can help you with that. So just stay with me for one more second. Let me go back to your dissertation one more time. And let me go back to, yes, view, and then outline. Now, what I am suggesting means probably a really rewrite of the opening chapter and rethinking how you state some of this. Now, there are paragraph sentences in here that are still good. You can hang on to them. As a matter of fact, if you're working, you can actually move paragraphs around in the outline view. So this gives you a way of reorganizing the material in a hurry and hanging on to what you think is good and just maybe rethinking its, hang on, it's where it sets up. So this is why I like outline view. That way you're not constantly rewriting everything, but you're able to see stuff in a much more tighter place. But next thing I'm just going to say is, and I'm going to skip the first chapter and go down to the second chapter for a minute. And this is where these levels can come in in a very handy manner. So as I've noted, right now, the only level you've used is level 1. So if I go back, and so that then you can even literally, you can open up, you can, well, excuse me, you can go back to, you can click on a chapter. I think memory, this has been a while since I've done this, so I'm better err to something that's easier. Go back to all levels, and you can be on chapter 2 again. And my question is, which of these headings are major headings, major points of argument? Which of them are subheadings under? So your theoretical framework, again, I mean, you might change that title and just basically say understanding community and the nature of connection. Don't use artificial titles. Use real titles that help me connect. And is that a very large component? So, and it appears to be. I mean, you got all this other material here that goes in under it. So do you actually need a separate heading, even as you see it this way? Theoretical framework. Does this common identity theory, is that a heading? Would that be I mean, it appears to be that since it's used this way. So what if you go, okay, so if the chapter is heading 1, so theoretical framework is not a body text, but it's a level 2. So the chapters are level 1, those are level 2. And so I can go down here in common identity theory, and I can give that a level 3. And I'm going, okay, in common bond theory, then it needs to be, since it fell in under there, it really needs to be a level 3. And that, what you're beginning to do is start to see that you need, okay, wait, when I get toward the end, where you're talking about church online ritual, do I actually need I would probably not need anything there, but when I get back to the history of the online church, now is that back to a level 2. And what you're doing, you may go, okay, well, there's 3 churches, 4 churches, that your 5 churches you're mentioning under here. That's a lot of churches, but I'm going to leave that where it is. And then as I mentioned earlier, This goes to a level 2 as well. But now you're starting to ask, which of these go first? I mean, so if this is level 2, and this is level 2, not body text, and this is level 2. Is that how these flow? Or are some of these underneath each other? So, for instance, theology of online church and the legitimacy of online church, are they actually better, more closely aligned? And then the theology of church connection, as I pointed out earlier, and the online community connections, which is level 2, are they more closely aligned? Now I'm going to stop because then or is these do all three of these, the theology, the church connection, the online church, and the legitimacy of the online church, all three of those go together. And then online community connections actually is the next major one. So if that were true, for instance, then you could make this one level 3 and make this one level 3. And now you're back to here. Now I'll stop with that. I'm just showing you mechanics right now, but except for one more thing. Then when you write the introduction to each chapter, your introduction to each chapter should include how the chapter flows. So here, you give me kind of a general first sentence, and then the themes of oneness and interconnected church have been challenged in multiple ways, but the idea of interconnection had multiple facets. But all this seems to be, doesn't tell me anything at all, and I'm down through about the 5th paragraph, about when does the theology of the online church, when does the legitimacy, when does other connections come in, when do I introduce the problem of the digital connection? And if that's the most important piece of the puzzle, then does, how, in other words, how do these other headings inside the chapter fit? And what's their relationship to each other? And I should see a paragraph that really tells me that in the first 1 or 2 paragraphs of that chapter. And that should be true in every one of these. You need to let the reader know how the chapter unfolds. And if you cannot tell the reader the relationship between the headings inside the rest of the chapter, if you can't tell them that in a paragraph or so, then you probably need to rethink what the whole chapter is trying to accomplish. I think you can, but I don't see it. And as a reader, as I'm meandering around, and this is a good example, I'm meandering around in all this sort of history, I have no clue what's coming. Whereas you could even start and basically, actually you could, in theory, type in history of church connectedness, and this outline view, and you give that, okay, I'm going to give that a level 2. So it now becomes a heading, and you can, if you want, you can actually still, in outline, bold it. And then here, and I'll just, you can just write a paragraph that provides an overview of the chapter. Now, the nice thing about using it this way, since you've got your first draft, is this helps you more in a more condensed manner see everything you need to be doing. And then if you close it, guess what? Those headings are there. And that work has been done so far. And so you can go back and see it in regular form. Now, I will say this, the headers always create chaos with the formatting directly underneath it. And so if you have to, concede an extra line here and figure out some way to get around that, there's a way to do that just by using the paragraph view. And you just basically say, well, after just give it a 12, and it just sets itself up. And then you've solved that problem when it comes to technical. What's really important is that outline view helps you to really see the entire dissertation in a snapshot and begin thinking about, why are those headings there? And what did you intend with that part of the argument, and move forward as a result of it. If you do that in the outline view, I think you can make a lot of the repairs that I see necessary in the flow of the argument and still be fine in the next edition. But I'm going to close just very briefly by saying one thing really important. But if you really feel that you're determined that what you thought was literature doesn't show it, and so I need to claim that I did good ethnography to prove that corporate prayer is going to be the best approach in a digital environment, then I need to step out, because I just don't think you did that. However, if you can concede in your heart with your primary reader, so let me state it this way, that maybe that ethnographic work wasn't as robust. So I'll just go ahead and use insights from those interviews early. And then I will still say I'm doing a contextual analysis, both from the history of corporate prayer and from the online analysis of these global prayer initiatives. And that doesn't require interviews at all to do that. You're just reviewing the material that's there. And you think you can still suss out the same principles based on the intersection of both that historical work and that contemporary analysis of the context of these global prayer movements. Then offer the epic as a way of moving forward. If you can drop the qualitative ethnographic and go that route, then I think you can salvage a lot of them. So to kind of summarize, and I know this has been a longer video than I intended. Number one, you're probably going to have a stronger introduction, one that really actually argues what you discovered instead of telling people what you hope to find. And so I always hate that about these kind of dissertation introductions that really don't really pick up on what the abstract is trying to communicate and push that early. So what was the context that got you motivated? Here's what you discovered, and this is why it's important, and how it's going to flow in and through the rest of the dissertation. And you can keep things like key terms, because that's always helpful. But some of the other material, just research problem, research questions, I'm not sure you need those because you're done with those. You now have the answers that you want to try to communicate. Then, if you can fix the introduction, actually correct, maybe reorganize some of the material as I've suggested, and correct the introductions to each of the chapters so that you're telling me a story. It's a narrative flow all the way to the end, and you let go of the need for ethnographic methodology. You just release that. Even the language of interview, just release that and still talk about contextual analysis. I think you've got a way to go forward. You'll have a lot of writing to do. It's a rewrite, but you've got material there. It's not necessarily that you missed anything. It's just that if you really want to try to claim ethnography, you have a lot you have not made obvious. And if you don't have it, don't try to use it that way. I know this has been long. I probably could have said it more succinctly in writing it out, and you'll see that in the draft I send you. But I want you to hear me. I think you can get through this dissertation. I do think that. I think you have a lot more writing than you realize to do. And it's as much about form and style of the dissertation as well as the underneathness of the evidence and support. One parenthetical, I did notice in a lot of the material, you had sort of two layers of digital research material. Some of it was sort of early 2000s to around 2010. And then all of a sudden, bingo, you're back up into the 2020s, sort of the COVID, just pre and late and post COVID era. Um, that's always it's always hard because you got to be careful that you're not using the old literature to show the limitations of the literature review and suddenly the new literature in backing up your observations. So just follow your footnotes and make sure that doesn't happen. But that's so much just in the weeds after you do this next rewrite that I don't want that to bother you right now. Hear the encouragement. You have a pretty good project. You really do. Hear the caution. It needs a better writing. Hear the real on and off switch, but it doesn't need an ethnographic methodology to prove its point. If you can live with that, then I think I can hang around as a second reader. And I might even suggest some things around the epic language in the next read. But that would be the last time, and then I'm going to give you a much more limited sort of engagement because second readers just don't invest that much energy outside of, well, now this first reading and trying to get you to reorganize the material. But I will go back and do what I said, sort of close off your thesis and see how epic really proves your point. I will do that in the next this round of the dissertation writing. I think you can get there. I just hope that you have the energy, the time, and again, I would say talk with Dr. Saddles, and that if you do this, it respects what she desires as well, or else we just find a different person to support you in and through the rest of this work. So my prayers to you and blessings, and I'll send you also the document later, but I just wanted to make sure you had this as a sort of honest conversation, albeit a long one, via Zoom. Blessings. Bye-bye.